I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
So today I'm going to be discussing one of my favorite films of the previous decade, Blade Runner 2049. As many have already convincingly argued, I think Denis Villeneuve's masterpiece is close to a perfect sequel. But this will not be a review of the film. I'm not really here to tell you why it's a good film, why I like the film. You may or may not like it. It's always a subjective thing. Today I'm going to talk about something broader, the film's meaning in the context of its history. I will aim to show that Blade Runner 2049 is something of a throwback to a different era, not really of cinema, but of Western art generally. I believe that Blade Runner 2049 is possibly a new defining work of Neo-modernism, an emerging school of creative thought that deals with the world in terms of the end of the postmodern movement, a world that is post-spectacle and mirrors that of the world in the 1920s and 1930s. Or put a slightly more accessible way, the film lends a new kind of relevance to early 20th century works about identity and decay, but does so without ignoring the century of art and philosophy which has resulted from it. Thus, I posit that a filmgoer of the 1920s or 1930s would recognize in it the basic problems of their own age, presented through a story world that has forgotten those ideas and doesn't recognize them within itself. Indeed, the audience of a century ago might even find this film easier to understand and appreciate than the audience of today, steeped as we are in a consumer culture that has only just begun to unravel. I believe it is this neo-modernist sensibility that lends the film so much weight and makes it, frankly, terrifying to watch. By moving beyond the inconcrete, mostly allegorical sci-fi of the 21st century so far, represented in popular works like The Hunger Games, Black Mirror, and other techno-dystopian fables about the abuse of power or the perversities of uses of new technology, BR 2049 crafts a distinctly modern foundation from which to examine not only our own age, but a far more realistic depiction of a possible future. In this way, the film comments upon the renewed crisis of identity in our age, which mirrors that of a century ago, while applying the methods and ideas of modern critical theory, which were not available then. So, in order to accomplish this, we're going to be jumping between a few different themes. We're going to be talking about the development of technology since the beginning of the modern period, which many people would place around 1870, or I would say the high modern period of the 1920s and 30s, and also be talking about the postmodern period, which is generally identified as beginning after the Second World War, We'll be defining those terms, and we'll also be talking about the process of automation transforming the economy and impacting on our understanding of critical theory. So that involves anything from definitions of work and economic gain to the principles by which art is made and for what purpose. As art from the 19th century transforms from a narrative device, which is meant to unite cultures around specific mythos, the postmodern deals with themes of decay and destruction influenced by the First and Second World War, and the postmodern incorporates much more academic, high-level theory into the function of art in society. So we will be going through all that. So expect to jump between a few major disciplines in that process. Looking back on this, I found it somewhat relevant to add that the poem which forms the prologue to this video is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. That's the husband of Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein. Thematically, Shelley and both Percy and Mary were important influences on the development of modernist literature, although they worked within formulas, or should say frameworks, which were much more of the high romantic or the Gothic aesthetic period. The themes of destruction, of the decay of time, and of renewal were very important themes in the 19th century. So we should not forget that the thematic elements of the 19th century lead into the period of modernist experimentation with form. So works like Ozymandias, this poem, although it takes the form of a classic poem with a classic structure, a sonnet. Nevertheless, the visual and thematic material offers a good sense of where writers and artists were looking to go with their art during that period. So we shouldn't draw a bright line between the high romantic and the modern. The high romantic also was concerned with death and destruction and renewal, but was not yet applying it formatically, or applying it, let's say, programmatically in the structures of their works. I saw this film in the cinema twice. I realized that I was seeing something really new, something I hadn't expected. And for years, I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about, what do I have to say about it? Today, I'm decided to formulate my thoughts and share them with you. I'll warn you, I found, as I was writing this, although it's 10,000 words long, that I don't really have a lot of conclusions. I think I can offer a lot of insight into what's going on in the film, but I think not to be hokey, but I think the conclusions have to be drawn from the self. What it means to you is what it means. I'm just trying to give you some background to understand what I think are some of the principles and some of the ideas that went into making it. That begins with typical poetry and aesthetic movements of the periods we're going to be talking about, along with the interaction of technology with society and entertainment, from which we will dive into the world of the film. 20th century philosophies and movements. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. This essay will not be a comprehensive nor a definitive survey of all 20th century philosophy and art movements. Even if I were up to such an essay, I don't think that would be productive in discussing a particular property. But what is important to identify is the core intellectual movements that are at play in Blade Runner 2049 and how they connect. To clearly define the terms as I will be interpreting them, these are roughly in chronological order. The philosophy of consequentialism, an ancient tradition of reasoning. In their most basic sense, consequentialist philosophies consider actions as endowed with meaning in a moral sense. While often distinctly religious and prescriptivist, consequentialism has also been embraced by analytical philosophers who seek to explain systems such as society and relationships in terms of a series of actions and consequences. This idea underpins the philosophy of Catholicism, for example, which focuses on redemption as an act of will rather than of mere belief. And we can compare that with evangelical Christianity, which focuses on belief over acts of redeeming value, to be very general. Materialism at core is the belief that the world is predicated upon the physical rather than the mystical, and the idea that all observable reality is the same regardless of the observer or lack thereof. Materialism forms more or less the initial basis for the most prevalent worldviews of the 19th and 20th centuries, Marxism and capitalism. Materialism, under which those two approaches to reality formed, is most famously argued that God is dead, that the world is concrete and predictable. Modernism, somewhat of a rejection or a subversion of materialism and consequentialism. Modernism seeks to explore the consequences of decay and destruction, or simply of change, on the actions of individuals and groups, focusing on the chaotic interactions between people in the act of questioning the materialist and consequentialist worldviews. According to some modernists, human beings are constantly in conflict with the truth of their own history, seeking to incorporate their trauma within their worldview without being destroyed by it. Modernism begins to depart from a classical norms of artistic form and function in order to comment upon them. Modernism is often referred to as art for art's sake. It's self-referential, it's self-aware. Postmodernism, characterized by an even more broadly applied suspicion of materialism, and it takes the methods of the modernist movement to their logical extreme, drawing into question the function of analytical reasoning and often associating ideology with the defense and perpetuation of systems of power. Though postmodernism rarely rejects modernism, it may do away with traditional forms in their entirety. Postmodernism is often described as reactionary because it can openly challenge convention, sometimes as its main artistic form. So postmodernism does away with the rules and does away with them intentionally as a means of questioning the purpose of those rules, and that includes the purpose of analytical reasoning. Can anyone have a truly objective opinion of anything? And if they can't, then what is the function of art? These are very mustered as an opening to a discussion of popular culture, but you won't really need to refer to these definitions to understand what I'm going to talk about. Many of the ideas under discussion have intuitive examples, and I've included them when possible for clarity. If you don't like my definitions or examples, well, sorry. These are the ones that I'll be working from. The rise and fall of materialism. While materialism in and of itself is really just the core belief that the world is physically congruous, making it explainable and predictable, these views have powerfully influenced the development of philosophical and artistic thought since the 19th century especially. They've also become strongly associated with a culture of materialism, which is not exactly the same as the philosophical school of materialism. It's really the consequence of the application of materialism to our lives in an economic sense. We now often call this tendency consumerism, and modern critics point out that we base our understanding of what is good for society on the number of goods that can be produced, even if this equivalence is a false one, even if the equivalence is a destructive one. That's not just a tenet of modern consumer capitalism, but also a tenet of communism. These are really just two ways of applying the same core beliefs. That is, better for everyone to seek a means to produce the most material benefit for all people, with the belief being that material benefit will be followed by spiritual benefit or personal freedom. The 20th century Irish writer and critic Francis Hackett was quoted in 1948 in an economics textbook. "I believe in materialism. I believe in all the proceeds of a healthy materialism: good cooking, dry houses, dry feed, sewers, drain pipes, hot water, baths, electric lights, automobiles, good roads, bright streets, long vacations from the village pump, new ideas, fast horses, swift conversation, theaters, operas, orchestras, bands. I believe in them all for everybody. The man who dies without knowing these things may be as exquisite as a saint and as rich as a poet, but it is in spite of, not because of, his deprivation." We can see here that materialism by 1948 is nearly totally focused on consumer goods and entertainments. With understandable reason. Between about 1870 and 1970, developed nations or developing nations enjoyed a rapid, seemingly endless string of major improvements in their standards of living. Virtually every aspect of modern life was becoming measurably better. Less expensive, less tedious, less dangerous, less boring, and less arduous. Robert J. Gordon, the economist, in his comprehensive study of economic growth from 1870 to 1970, I recommend you read it. It's very long, but it's very interesting. The rise and fall of American growth. He argued that technological automation and the advancement of material science and medicine during this period eliminated the majority of drudgery and danger that humans had experienced from the beginning of the agricultural revolution until 1870. He describes this period as the fruition of an economic dream that had existed since the founding of the first permanent human settlements up to 15,000 years ago. But by 1970, he argues, the marginal benefits of new layers of automation began measurably to decrease. So how do we incorporate this? It's hard to argue with this logic if you think about it. We often consider the history of automation to reside somewhere in the near to medium future, always observing the economic upheavals associated with technological automation through the lens of political economy and through our own lives, joblessness, income inequality, and public finances. But Gordon argues that the majority of technological advancement associated with automation per se that humans are likely to experience is actually behind us. How can this be possible? Look at this idea through a simple analogy. What did the day of a typical member of the mid-economic quartiles, the middle 50% of society consist of in 1870? A close study of the data shows that what we consider to be housekeeping occupied spans of time often greater than a typical working week. Clothes washing, cleaning, daily ablutions, home repairs, cooking, making of clothes and soaps, and other household necessities occupied many hours, were tedious and often dangerous. By 1870, a typical daily routine for a member of the same middle two quartiles of economically developed nations consisted largely of paid work, a change strongly influenced by the near total automation of household work and the commodification of household comforts. So you don't have to make your own soap, you can buy it. You don't have to hunt your own food, you can buy it. And that gives you a lot more time. It gives you a lot more time to be economically productive in a much more impactful way in the lives of other people. And this trend also powerfully shaped the economic world outside the home. Agriculture, manufacturing, public works, and services were largely automated. The share of the population that was doing agriculture and before 1870 was about 30%. By the 1920s and 30s, it was about 3%. And we all know about the modern day upheavals that caused. But one can hardly argue that it produced less material wealth overall. It increased inequality, but for reasons we'll discuss later. So people were separated ultimately from the production of their own daily sustenance and comfort. And that has profound impacts on society. This new abundance also allowed a new socioeconomic paradigm in which households could afford, practically, to share the role of economic provider and to pass off many familial duties such as education and healthcare to professionals who were in turn economically available due to the automation of their own lives via transportation, communication, industrial food production, and mechanical automation. This created a world in which most of the essential work of one's upkeep is automated. Though automation does not directly replace the human being, it does extend an individual's power to produce, offering more shared abundance that could be earned by new economic modalities. So while work is, as an objective function of the amount of goods produced by a certain amount of work, was decreasing, the number of jobs was increasing. If more people can make it into offices because they have transportation, they have food, so they don't need to worry about their food every day. They can buy goods, meaning they don't have to worry about preparing them. Then they can work more, and therefore they can somehow produce more. Let's just consider another analogy to explain this. Suppose you were a gardener in 1870. In 1870, only the very rich could afford gardeners. In fact, lawns are sort of a creation of Victorian or Edwardian England, really. The idea of public parks was bringing that kind of comfort and entertainment to the masses. But for years, lawns and manicured gardens had been a sign of great economic power. Only the very rich could afford gardeners, and one of the reasons was that it required so much work and expertise. Manicuring a lawn, shaping a bush, laying stone paths, all specialized and difficult work, with very little automation, carried out by hand. The implements and other materials were also made and manufactured by hand. You had to make your own shovel, you had to make your own spade, you had to make your own concrete, you had to make your own bricks. The implements and other materials were also made and maintained by hand, involving a large number of participants in maintaining a single garden. Now jump through time to 1970. The number of gardens in a technological society has increased by orders of magnitude. Virtually every home can afford to have one. This is because of automation. Cars allow gardeners to service more clients. Machines allow them to work faster. Advancements in chemical science will enable them to buy commodity soil and fertilizers, and so on. All up the chain, jobs are being eliminated by automation, but because this allows more people to afford gardens, the total number of jobs still increases. You have created more wealth, in a certain manner of speaking, with a proportional decrease in the work required for that wealth on a per unit or per person basis. This trend had been breakneck for nearly a century by the 1960s, but what followed, somewhat unexpectedly for generations that crazed with the ever-burgeoning promise of more and better products and services, more wealth for everyone, was an age of paranoia and social and economic stagnation, often referred to as the malaise of the 1970s. The Western consumer society reached peak automation, according to Gordon, around 1970, with the result, though society's overall productivity and wealth did not decline, the delta of upward progress, the rate at which growth continued in our shared economic prospects, decreased. In the face of slowing growth of wealth and creature comfort, developed societies slowly began to grow paranoid, not only of the loss of these comforts or of the feeling that the endless economic growth of the past century might eventually reverse entirely, but also of the reality that these comforts and conveniences were becoming commodified to the point that society was producing enough, more or less, and that soon those of lower socioeconomic status, particularly racial minorities, might begin to enjoy the benefits of materialism themselves in larger numbers. Or even worse, from the perspective of a still racially divided society, that people of color would demand access to the same positions of power as was enjoyed by the white majority. This produced something of a peak growth effect, in which the new economic paradigm, eventually via the financialization of the Reagan and Thatcher economies of the 1980s, was to grow one's own financial security through the explicit exploitation of informational and capital inequities. Basically, knowing more and having more becomes a means of defending one's economic status. Notice also here the differences between the business paradigms of the 1950s to the 1960s versus the 70s and 80s. We go from the persona of the artist, Don Draper, in an era where knowing the right people is the key to success, where family still continues to matter, to Gordon Gekko of the 1980s, when success is almost wholly technocratic, where knowing people is simply a convenience, but an outsider with the right information and the right guile can achieve success. As the difference is demonstrated in these two pieces of art, Don Draper has to pretend to be someone he isn't in order to succeed, whereas Gordon Gekko benefits from showing people exactly who he is. Essentially, to weaponize the existing economic inequality in order to secure the elite class against integration on racial or class lines. I know what you're shouting at the screen. The 1980s experienced the computer revolution. How can this be? How can this be less automation? Our lives are so much better today. And from a purely selfish perspective, I agree with this. I like Netflix and iPhones as much as you do, maybe more. However, when we're considering having to choose between Netflix or only 3 channels on television, with having to choose between not having electricity and having it, one of these is clearly overwhelmingly of greater relative benefit. It's much worse to live without electricity than it is to live with only 3 channels, right? So even though our comforts are increasing, sometimes very fast, the impact on our lives may not increase nearly as quickly. You can only watch so much television. But electricity fundamentally reshapes your life. Though the computer revolution deeply impacted the typical daily life of many people, it did not represent that kind of a step change in human productivity. This is in the economic numbers. People did not produce 2, 3, 4 times more goods because of computerization. It just didn't happen. Wealth continued to increase, but not because of higher productivity. Instead, computers represented a slower era of economic growth that mirrored the compounding increases in computing power that had been made available. Paradoxically, the computer produced a new ability to multiply wealth via financialization and eventually via platformization of the information economy, but this incredible new wealth was hardly shared. As time has gone on, technology has slowly shifted to a rent-seeking economic model, in which consumers pay what amounts to a tax in order to stay in touch with the ever-changing information economy. We now pay for access to the tools of economic productivity. Our internet bills, our phones, and the entertainment services we enjoy have taken the form of an exploitative system of rents. Not unlike those of previous eras when utilities and travel were operated by officially sanctioned monopolies. The impact of having a Google or a Facebook or even an Apple is analogous to having a Bell telephone that, in a way, holds back progress and innovation. They continue to offer better services, but there is not this pluralism of continually bubbling up playing field of new ideas and new products. Instead, most products are iterative. So over time, everything becomes versionized. And this is because of the way the financial system works, which is that they need to continue to raise revenues and lower costs. Now, if singularity theory is correct, the idea that eventually computers will become so powerful that they'll be able to design their successors, then compounding growth in computer power may eventually lead to another period of similarly profound changes in human life. But I doubt this. There are reasons to be suspicious of it. One reason is the simple rarity of resources on Earth. While computer power growth might be exponential, the availability of resources, for now, does not seem to be. Maybe this is a subject for a different video, but suffice to say that my conclusion, at least so far, mirrors that of Blade Runner 2049. Our continued need to exploit Earth's resources will eventually lead to a state in which exploitation is the only economic activity that is sustained. Progress in consumer technology and indeed human comfort slows or even regresses. The exploitation of people, the environment, and the machines becomes the de facto state of the world. A tree that can no longer grow vertically must grow in girth instead. As the amounts of energy available to an organic system begins to decline, the only other option is to kill off competition for limited resources. Thus, the world of Blade Runner 2049 begins in a post-capitalist landscape, one in which a powerful caste system ensures that the powerful remain powerful and the exploited are literally unable to rebel. Mass media is absent, at least from the perspective of our main characters. All entertainments are personalized and disconnected from other people, and virtually all, except for Deckard's.
He reads. That's good. Me too.
Is explicitly exploitative of artificial intelligence, of the Earth, or of other people. This is an era where the classics are dead, where individual creativity seems largely to be dead. This process has its beginnings in the here and now. Wages are not continuing to grow at 10% per year because there needs to be a fundamental reason, such as rising productivity or rising commodity values, for them to grow. Conversely, inflation rises at more than 10% a year, indicating that the need for resources is increasing faster than their supply. So every year you're getting paid less relatively to the cost of everything, and the availability of things like housing, food, water, and energy are becoming less as a result in proportion to the size of the economy. What do companies do in a world of diminishing growth and increasing demand? Well, we've seen it. They must grow via increased market share and at the expense of competitors and customers rather than to their mutual benefit. If the need for your products increases, it makes sense to squeeze the individual for higher profits from lower quality products, or at least from products that don't improve nearly as quickly and are provided more and more sparingly. Notice the difference between buying a telephone 20 years ago versus buying one today. 20 years ago, a telephone was already a commodity product. could be bought for almost nothing. Now, every year, although the power of phones increases, the economic burden of buying them increases even faster. And the marginal benefit of having that much more powerful of a phone is not as high, doesn't rise as fast. So yes, you're getting amazing advances over a long period, but you are also paying considerably more for a decreasing marginal benefit. The iPhone of today is not that different from the iPhone of 10 years ago. They do almost all the same things, but this one costs 3 times as much. Then companies must inevitably grow by mining any potential savings that can be gained from eroding workers' rights and standards of living. Thus began in the 1980s an era of corporate collusion, fraud, financial engineering, raiding, and exploitation that in turn reduced the economic security of the middle and working class simply to provide a means of growing the value of capital at any cost. The financial system began to become one of the largest drivers of economic growth on paper, while creating absolutely nothing in the way of the means of living for ordinary people. The tensions and class paranoia inspired by these trends reshaped society's relationship to the state and the economy. After all, a society in which the living standards of the most powerful group, white male Americans, are slowing and the economic circumstances of Black Americans are growing, this invites or even necessitates the gradual integration of society across class lines and threatens existing class boundaries. This begins an era of white flight and suburban decay. It also begins an era of distrust for the government, even from the most economically empowered groups. So you begin in the 1960s with the civil rights movement and Black Americans especially being allowed into universities, into government jobs especially, and within a generation, the opinions of these developments among white Americans are manifested by their distrust, their growing distrust of free education, their growing distrust of government employment and government work. And a lot of that, underlying that, is a fear of racial integration, a fear of equality. Thus begins, like I said, an era of white flight and suburban decay. The answer to these growing tensions in the 1980s was not to attempt to change the underlying economic relationships or race relations, but to reintroduce economic stratification to maintain a divided society. By reversing this progress from the top down via so-called trickle economics, which conveniently promises to the middle class that they will inherit the stolen wealth of the top, leaving very little for the bottom of the social hierarchy. A little discussed aspect of Reaganomics, indeed, but I think one of the most important ones. Western societies arrested the convergence of classes from the top down, creating a new and growing stratification, which has kept society from fundamentally changing its economic model by redistributing wealth upward. So even though wealth has continued to increase, the share from class to class has remained the same or gotten even more extreme. And that has maintained a divided society while continuing to increase production and wealth. The connections with Bladerunner 2049 may already begin to present themselves here, not only in the sense of consumer economics, but also of race and class relations. But I promise we'll circle back to that. In a sense, then, the timely 1967 publication of a small pamphlet of Marxist-inspired critical theory by a philosopher named Guy Debord, titled The Society of Spectacle, was met with a receptive audience seeking a critical understanding of their own growing economic anxiety. Even in the context of a world that had never been richer, we can arguably identify the beginning of the death of materialism in the pages of this book. which have gone on largely to redefine the academic understanding of progress and the role of work in the modern economy. Debord's book is not simple, which is one of the reasons it belongs on this channel, but it's also not the focus of this video. Reading it will help you to understand its connection with BR 2049, but it's not crucial. It's enough to understand that Debord described a world that was realizing the limitations of economic growth as a driver of social stability and coming to face the new reality of consumerism. Out of ways to deeply innovate in areas concerning the core advances of the 1870 to 1970 period, what could society turn to as a means of stratifying and maintaining social class distances? If you just think about it, in 1870, only the richest person could afford someone to wash their clothes. By 1970, even the poorest person can afford a dishwasher or a clothes washer. So how can you maintain a distance, social and economic, between the poor who need to be exploited for profit and the rich who need to do the exploiting? If we all have the same standards of living or close to them, how can you exploit people? One way was to transition from a society of consumption for the purposes of comfort and begin to treat consumption as a means to its own end, maintaining growth in the face of a slowing material need. Cars got bigger, houses got bigger, channels got more numerous, mass media exploded with choice. Another way, and as Debord argues, the only sustainable way to maintain this stratification and distance between class and race is to fundamentally change the purpose of consumption itself. Thus, the society of spectacle emerges from the need to create value in an economic sense and to maintain social power distances at the same time, with a diminishing set of actual resources available to do all of this. Consumption becomes a central element of class, and experience becomes a central element of consumption. The drive to gain more experience and more knowledge begins to define class far more than the conspicuous consumption of goods. At the same time, an ever-increasing expectation of more and better experiences becomes a primary driver of economic engagement and class division. The rich get what they pay for better services, better vacations, better education, better exclusive entertainments. And the only choice for the consumer whose economic mobility is decreasing is to try to demand more from their own experiences, seeking a commodified version of an elite life. Today, you use an iPhone, maybe an iPhone Pro, and the richest person in the world probably uses the same thing. So how can you be divided? Well, one way is for that richest person in the world to take constant vacations or to fly to work every single morning and fly home every single night. That is the kind of experience, it's the kind of power that you cannot attain, that has no purpose other than to separate you. Thus, the concept of the consumer is always right emerges, in which consumers are encouraged to play the dual roles of economically oppressed and oppressor, enduring the injustices of management overreach or customer abuse at work, and dealing out this overreach and abuse in other areas of their lives, including among families and in the act of consumption. This participation in exploitation for the purpose of gaining experiences overwhelms the need to consume lavish goods, casting the act of seeking material wealth as low class, given that experiences and knowledge become the only thing that can possibly separate society's classes effectively. If you think about, in the modern period, the depiction of wealth, look at something like The Great Gatsby. F. Scott Fitzgerald's depiction of wealth is of idiocy. People have so much material good that they don't need to be smart. They don't need to be experienced. They can be ignorant. In fact, being ignorant is helpful to them because they can easily justify their own wealth. By 1970, and especially by today, we are meant to think of the rich and powerful as being extremely intelligent, even if they're not. Even if there's evidence, unignorable evidence, that they are not as smart as they think they are. Though gauche and gaudy consumer goods proliferate, their use is stigmatized by the elite class, who project their status by consuming goods whose meaning and purpose are mysterious to the lower classes, and which are presupposed to be something only a member of this elite can possibly enjoy. Thus, the blank white canvas selling for millions of dollars, or the collecting of dinosaur bones and curiosities becomes a means of maintaining class division, having things that other people simply cannot have. And as you may quite perceptively point out, how can it be that only the rich have access to fine arts like a blank canvas or a white canvas when anyone could make or buy such a canvas? And the reason that it's still considered an exclusive experience is that the art is ultimately defined by the experience of having it or owning it and paying for it. So the art community creates a context, a pretext in which that art is said to be valuable, and then those who can afford to participate with it can consume that value, essentially. It reminds one of the epic Banksy prank where he put his art up to auction, I think at Sotheby's, and when someone won the bid, the painting was sent right through a shredder, and that was, I think, really Banksy's commentary upon the spectacle of consuming art. A blank canvas is not defined by what it is. It's defined by who is experiencing it. Watching someone buy something like that is an experience, and being the one who buys it is supposedly a superior experience. So in that way, it creates a commodity value that cannot be copied or cannot be enjoyed by someone who doesn't have that kind of money. And by the way, I found that to be very perceptive and clever of Banksy, because today we're not talking about the person who tried to buy a simple painting for almost $1 million. We're talking about the work itself. So he successfully subverted the attempt to turn the purchase of his free art for the public, his graffiti art, into fine art by destroying that art before it could be sold, and in that way dispelling or dissolving the intent of Sotheby's, the intent of the buyers to turn the work into a piece of spectacle instead of a social commentary, which it was. The wealthy patronize the fine arts, first as a projection of power, but also as an opportunity to demonstrate to their social lessers that they are in control of the public's appetite for fine art. Tied up within this society of spectacle is objectification, not only of goods and experiences, but also of the self. A person is the sum of their experiences in a society of spectacle, and so the person must make their experiences visible to others to be judged in the appropriate context, at least for this kind of society. A person's travel, their food, their children, and their dogs are all objectified and compared, so as to determine who has the most experience, the most superior experience. Social media, far from disrupting this pattern of objectification, merely strengthens it and layers it with another system of objectification, that of big data and invasion of privacy. The need to generate an endless supply of experiences is made significantly easier by developing new genres of entertainment and loosening views of what entertainment was classed as acceptable or unacceptable, valuable or not valuable. The rise of popular and mainstream pornography, as well as comics, television, film, and the democratization of air travel all followed. Sometimes, as in the case of air travel, as an overt attempt to spur a new kind of economic growth, that of price competition driving higher overall consumption.
We have 6 identical companies making 6 identical products. We can say anything we want.
while deliberately providing a quantifiably worse service at the higher volume. And by the way, another consequence of deregulation of air travel was the literal separation of classes, from first to business to coach, demonstrating the class division physically by forcing the coach customers to walk through the first class cabin to observe the luxuries they cannot enjoy. In this modern society of spectacle, everyone is going to the same place and will arrive at exactly the same time, but the experience of first class will be far superior. So when the plane arrives, those in the first class will be ahead in terms of the experiences that they've gained. Meanwhile, popular philosophical literature promulgated the obsession with the self. A person was now more than the sum of their possessions, but became the sum of their experiences.
And you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams with reassurance that whatever you're doing, it's okay. You are okay.
That is the spectacle. This led to the share of economic activity in the realm of entertainment and travel skyrocketing. Eventually, as these outlets for growth became too common to promise steady and dependable growth, and so new experiences were engineered or marketed to new audiences. Physical conditioning, psychotherapy, college education, postgraduate education, soft skills training, and eventually wellness become new generators of wealth from the spectacle that offers consumers a new avenue to spend money, or maybe more importantly, to spend time.
I get it.
By the way, it should then be no surprise that Generation Z would be so infamous for emphasizing wellness in their lifestyles, up to and including refusing to work for employers who do not value wellness or do not put a lot of value on a person's mental well-being and control of their free time. Thus, Zoomers are looking to work less, not necessarily looking to make more money. And they're doing that because they recognize the value of their own time and their own experiences as being within a spectacle culture more valuable than the money. In the case of education, soon nearly the whole of the middle class was not only engaged in tertiary education, but in many cases engaged with the implicit belief that the debt that this experience entailed was an investment in future productivity and wealth, even as productivity across the economy was stagnating. This belief was exploited by the wealthy to convince governments to decrease their direct financial support of public education on the supposed theory that the experience of this education represented an economic value that should motivate the aspiring student to go into debt in order to achieve it. The increasing rates of college participation devalued the college degree while making it more expensive. It devalued it sometimes to the point of irrelevance, with employers focusing now on experience, again in areas in which the expense and exoticism of that experience can preserve the effective stratification of class. It's not as impressive to work in a local hospital or a homeless shelter than it is to travel to Bolivia and build houses. At the same time, the financialization of education saddled the working and middle class with an enormous debt, often eclipsing their long-term potential to achieve financial security. And that is where we are today. If you stayed with me through that, I thank you, and I promise you that it will be worth it. When we get to talking about Bladerunner 2049, you're going to see all this come into play. But before we get there, there's one connection that I'd like to make. The other key philosophical development of the 20th century was the accompanying transition from the art of art itself, that is, modernism, to the reactionary criticism of art through art, postmodernism. To take an uncharitable and functionalist view, the postmodern supplanted the modern simply because it offered a greater opportunity to provide growth via the society of spectacle. It's easier to make art about art, right? It's easier to be Tarantino than it is to be Scorsese. It's simpler because you're incorporating self-consciously the tropes of a common culture.
I don't remember asking you a goddamn thing.
And by the way, Scorsese now often does the same thing.
I understand perfectly, you American shit.
And books and television became highly self-referential because there's an existing lore, an existing philosophy, or an existing set of tropes.
Don't be stupid. This is the shootout.
That viewers become familiar with. This fall of materialism and the fundamental basis for our understanding of self and society, and the introduction of experientialism in higher education and the arts serve two complementary functions: to increase the number of experiences we consume, and to open up new, potentially endless avenues of avant-garde expression with which to feed experiences to others. So our lives become about consuming and regurgitating our experiences. Now we do it by Instagram, people do it via TikTok. And this is not just an abject criticism of this process. It is a part of a society of spectacle. Everything has to be mined. Everything has to be formalized. Everything has to be condensed into a trope or a meme in order to gain reach, because your slice of someone's attention is only so big. In this way, Debord described the society of spectacle as a permanent condition of post-materialism, one that cannot run out of ideas because there are no physical constraints upon the complication of experiences by new experiences. The potential for the growth of spectacle is possibly endless. But that's the uncharitable view. Let's complicate this with the charitable one as well. And to do that, we need to go and take another step back and talk about the role of modernism in getting us from the materialist to the postmodern. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. That was my favorite line from T.S. Eliot's epic poem, The Wasteland. And you'll see The Wasteland will become particularly relevant when we start talking about Bladerunner. Materialism was not merely and not even mainly a philosophical movement. It was a scientific movement. It was a technological movement. When people realized that we could formalize our thinking and make predictions based on math and chemistry, that changed the way that people thought. It changed the way that people perceived the world, and it offered an opportunity for us to radically change our lives. And we talked about that, the huge jump in living, in the quality of living between 1870 and 1970 was a direct result of materialism, as it found its way into philosophy like capitalism and communism as well. And it should never be forgotten that although Soviet communism is a failed political system, it was also a powerful organizing principle for a state that had been fairly disorganized. The Soviets managed to create a space program on a much smaller budget than the United States, simply because project management became easier when there was a rigid hierarchy based in some kind of materialist philosophy of cause and effect. That it was via the sciences that this tendency bled into literary and philosophical traditions of the Enlightenment. For example, the idea that one can derive a fundamentally objective assessment of the function of a piece of expression from a material analysis was a tendency driven by the 19th century fascination with the exciting new world of chemical and material science. But that same tendency of materialism and the positivist approach to the idea that you could quantify everything also led to horrifying things like racial theory, and white savior complex, and also created a sort of false science of public data, driving decisions which happen to be advantageous to those in power. Eventually that would be expressed in things like the bell curve, which Stephen Jay Gould completely ripped apart in his book on that subject. But these so-called statistical frameworks or scientific findings were very often used as a convenient method of enforcing an existing hierarchy. In a world that was discovering the ability for the first time in the 19th century to mathematically derive the properties of elements and chemical compositions that had not been synthesized, there was a natural tendency to believe that material analysis could be usefully applied to all kinds of things: art, literature, sociology, biology, chemistry, and atomic physics. Were discovering new properties of matter through mathematics. Why can't you do the same for other disciplines? Done it was, and often to disastrous effect, as we spoke of. This was particularly true in Germany, where the Frankfurt School and Theodor Adorno were strongly influenced not only by Freud, Marx, and Hegel, but also by the very real innovations being brought forth constantly from the realm of pure mathematics. It was a time in which mathematics was shaping history. Yet by 1970, the role of materialism in modern philosophy was hugely diminished, largely for the reasons we've already discussed. Things went wrong. Inevitably, materialism had real and noticeable geopolitical and sociological consequences. A world run by a materialist technocracy abandons the concept of essentialism, which we discussed before, the idea that actions matter, for the allure of scientific-seeming objectivism. So Nazi propaganda doesn't deal with reality. It simply deals on a level of spectacle, on a level of propaganda. You find that you can achieve a political goal simply by telling each person what they want to hear. And when political actors discover this, they can turn materialism against democracy. We see the same thing in the Brexit vote. We see the same thing going on in the United States. The fact that the political actors don't care about an objective truth and instead have embraced this idea that the world can be changed by substituting your own reality for what's real, and that being a scientific pursuit, a data-based pursuit, really destroys the concept of cause and effect, and it creates a political system that is not accountable to anything. Mass murder and starvation were seen as inconvenient realities of change, and not just by the Germans or the Japanese, but also by the British, the Americans, the Russians, everyone. The dropping of the atomic bomb is framed not as a mass murder, but as an act of geopolitical mercy. Yet it is still the instant annihilation of almost 1 million people. And accepting that, embracing that that contradiction inherent in that kind of mass murder was very important in bringing down the focus on materialism in the political world. Because if you could tell people that you were being merciful by killing millions of people, then what really is the point of evaluating individuals and believing that everyone has a value? We all become statistics. So materialism becomes too harsh, too real for a civilized society, which would like to believe better about itself. Material science had been put to use to produce mustard gas and Cyclone B. The advent of the atomic bomb and the scale and depth of human tragedy that occurred in the context of pseudoscience pseudosciences of materialism in America, Germany, Russia, China led many avant-garde artists to reject the fundamental belief that one can objectively measure anything, much less derive a model for effective art from a material analysis. And one of the core outcomes of this change was the materialization of skepticism, even within science, that data and objective reality really represented truth. Stephen Jay Gould questioned the idea that you can use statistical metrics to measure human beings on an individual or a sociological level. So after all, a century of materialist philosophy has resulted in an evolutionary jump or two in the brutality of war and states' power to reshape their national identities, aided by both real and pseudoscience. Marxism and Freud, as was, died in the genocides, both internal and external, that characterized the mid-20th century. The soul of 19th century Europe was crushed by the world wars, but it endured in America, where the horrors of the trenches and the atom bomb were distant and often out of focus, laundered to the public through newsreels and war bond campaigns. Again, the society of the spectacle. Americans experienced the war very largely through spectacle, not through personal experience, which was very different in Europe, where the war touched people individually. Only through the modernist literature of expatriate Anglo writers like George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, William Shirer, was the existential horror of the 30 years of European violence driven home, leaving American art somewhat behind the curve in the second half of the 20th century. This is why the true avant-garde arises first actually in Germany, with people like Schoenberg, who were seeking a new form of expression which was outside a predetermined set of cultural norms. How does modernism accomplish this? How does modernism escape from history? If materialism was a large 19th century building, then modernism is what you get when you pulverize the building with a 2-ton bomb and rebuild it from the material of the ruin. This is often more than a metaphorical tendency. If you've ever walked down the streets of residential areas in Berlin, you'll find that 1 out of 6 buildings is just gone. And every single one of those was hit by a bomb. And the city, for economic or sociological reasons, left those empty spaces and formed new communities, gardens, public access areas around it. That is the definition of the modern, working with the destruction that you inherit to create something new. Modernism is born among the ruins of war. T.S. Eliot eloquently describes it in that line. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. It's characterized by the chaos of destruction and the seeming meaninglessness of consequentialist philosophies, where the goodness of a person is defined by their actions. The writers of the modern were both participants in and victims of a conflict that shattered the moral world of the 19th century. Heroic sacrifice, the nobility of death, and romantic adventurism was pulverized, along with the broken soldiers of the First World War, where the whole world was left to pick up the pieces, along with a broader society that faced the near total destruction of institutions of state, empire, and class. States, World War I is often considered a war by timetable, meaning that states had reached an organizational level where they were able to organize the entire state for total war, but they quickly found that they were not able to maintain their control of the state without mobilizing it for war. So the tool of defense became an economic and a political necessity. World War I ultimately happened because states were figuring out how to have a military-industrial complex, but hadn't actually figured it out yet. The conflict inherent in the modern man, and by that I mean the modernist man, is the conflict between his inner reality and his public face. The wasted effort of latter-day materialism is the search to align the self with the image. This is why I called Golden Age television a reintroduction of modernist themes in a postmodern culture in my last essay. Characters like Don Draper of Mad Men or Tony Soprano of The Sopranos seek to align themselves with an acceptable public face and will use any means possible to appear normal, even by stooping to ever-increasingly abnormal behavior in private and in public. It's telling that in each of these examples, as well as many others in the difficult men subgenre of unredeemed anti-heroes, is that their moments of deliverance are fitting, not to their outward images, but to their inward lives. These stories typically end with an anti-hero accepting the falseness of their own public face and failing to fundamentally change as people. They align their inner rot with their outer actions. The redemption, for example, of Winston Smith in 1984 is not an act of rebellion. It is an acceptance of subjugation, an embrace, the destruction of the heroic facade that he couldn't sustain. But it was his submission to this brutal system of exploitation and propaganda which seeks to destroy him as an individual. That is what describes his arc. So as very many people talk about 1984 as if it's a warning about the state. I've always found that interesting because I don't think it's a warning really about the state. I think Orwell always assumed that the state would continue to seek as much power as possible. What it was really about was how an individual can be drawn to that kind of power and want ultimately to submit to it. Winston Smith loved Big Brother in the end. He submitted because part of his inner being wanted to. There was a fixation with romanticism. There was a fixation with individuality. But ultimately, he lets that go as a means of surviving. This arc of the fall, rise, and fall is a popular one in modernist literature. It highlights the unceasing conflict between society and the self and suggests that there is no solution to it. The modern man is trapped in a cycle of exploitation, passed from parent to child. It suggests that the typical life cycle of the modern human is to be exploited, to learn to exploit others, and then to teach this exploitation to one's children. Thus, Walter White, from Breaking Bad, his dying wish is to give his dirty money to his children, to inveigle them, to conspire with him to enjoy the fruits of his crimes. Don Draper's redemption is in discovering a way to exploit the free love movement for profit, going to a hippie retreat and then writing Give the World a Coke.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing with me.
And this was an exploitation and a refutation of that movement by folding it into consumerism. Tony Soprano's ultimate fate is to perpetuate the cycle of violence and corruption that has defined his life onto his children, with his daughter following the career path of a mob lawyer and his son entering the world of shady mafia-adjacent front businesses. These gestures allow our modern men, and it is usually men, to assert control over their own children in a lasting and meaningful way, either through money or culture or social influence. The consummation of a full life is in the final lasting exploitation of one's own children. And I really think that this golden age of television I'm referring to, somewhere between 1999 and maybe today, really heavily emphasizes this process because they're being made, these shows are being made by generations of people who have experienced this cycle, the brutality of this cycle of consumerism, of capitalism, in which people are taught to be exploitative and told that they must be exploited themselves. So this leads finally to Blade Runner 2049. I went as long as I could without talking about it. It took more than 6,000 words to get to the discussion of the actual film in the title of this video.
Must have been brutal.
But again, if you've hung around this long, I think you'll be glad you did, because the groundwork we've laid will make this discussion very easy. One of the reasons I structured the essay this way, front-loaded with an enormous info dump about modernism and the society of spectacle, is that I wanted to prepare myself critically for a viewing of this movie for the purposes of this essay, without having any of the details of the actual film at hand. So I've done this first part, and then I've gone back and I've seen the film. So if you haven't seen the film yet, stop the video here, go off, watch the film today or tomorrow, and then come back and we'll discuss it. A few hours later. So I'm back. I suspect that many of the points I raised in discussing the nature of a modern society and the society of spectacle are now drawn into sharper focus in the context of the film. The epigram from the beginning of this essay should take on more significance. The poem by Percy Shelley, Ozymandias. The imagery of Ozymandias is all over the film. I showed that during the introduction. It's clear. And Ozymandias, though it wasn't a modern work, it was definitely a foundational work for the modernist movement. But Blade Runner actually engages with a couple of other poems as well, and I'm going to talk about these. One of them is another, let's say, set of couplets from The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Now, this was written right around the time of The Rite of Springs, by 1919, 1920. And they have very similar themes. And these themes become very apparent in Blade Runner when you make the comparison. So Eliot writes, "What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief." Already it's redolent of Blade Runner 2049, heaps of broken images, the data being destroyed, memories being jumbled, roots that clutch and branches growing out of stony rubbish. This is the imagery that defines this film, growth in amongst death. It's interesting, I think, that the framing device for the emotional journey of Officer KD 6-3.7 is a poem from the Nabokov novel, Pale Fire. If you don't know Nabokov, he's an incredible writer who wrote in at least 3 languages professionally, and makes one wonder what kind of incredible intellect someone has to start learning English in their 40s and then become one of the most celebrated writers in the English language. He wrote Lolita, that was his most famous work, the one you probably heard of. But this poem, The Wasteland, closely mirrors Pale Fire's poem, and that's been used, in the baseline test.
Let's begin. Ready? Recite your baseline.
That happens about right at the beginning of the film, and then right about at the beginning of the third act. And it sort of defines Kay's journey from being a slave into being someone who ostensibly makes his own choices, and examines his emotional responses to prompts about loneliness, regret, fear, love, and sentimentality. His journey through the film story is highly reminiscent of Eliot's poem, someone grasping through the wasteland trying to find themselves and finding many different entities there that help him to define his identity. And Blade Runner follows a similar pattern. It's a detective work. He walks through various environments, all of them very distinct, and meets individual obstacles, mostly people, and very different kinds of people who he has to overcome or understand something from. So the organization of the film is very straightforwardly a hero's journey, but also a commentary on the waste, the decay of the future. In some ways, though, Nabokov's own poem functions as something of a dark mirror of Eliot's. In a sense, they are opposite and complementary. To remind you of the text, and blood-black nothingness began to spin, a system of cells interlinked within cells, interlinked within cells, interlinked within one stem, dreadfully distinct against the dark, a tall white fountain played. Think about the meaning of this when we consider the imagery of Eliot's poem. This is a heap of broken images. Dead tree gives no shelter, cricket no relief, the sun beats. This poem is quite the opposite. Both passages evoke a sense of loneliness and fear. For Eliot, the dead tree gives no shelter, while for Nabokov, dreadfully distinct against the dark, a tall white fountain played. Again, a figure of desolation with a focus on something which is inanimate, something which is significant, like a negative image. Because for Nabokov, this is something shining in the dark. For Eliot, this is something being beaten down by the sun. Whereas Eliot is concerned with the ruin of a world that has been retaken by nature, Nabokov is interested here in the evolution of a natural system of life out of nothingness. So in this is blood-black nothingness that forms the setting of the poem instead of a dead space, instead of I should say, a decayed space. These two worlds come into direct conflict in Blade Runner 2049 as the light of Officer K's consciousness emerges as if organically from his experiences in a highly desolate, bright world. That's why it's his baseline, because it represents the growth of individuality in nothingness. Given the close relationships between the passages in structure and content, it's certainly plausible that the latter, Nabokov's, was meant to obliquely reference the former. What seems even more certain to me is that the parallels are part of the unspoken philosophies inherent to this film, be they of its director, Denis Villeneuve, or his screenwriter.
To improvise, you have to be, the ideas have to be very clear in advance. All the meaning has to come from prep. I deeply love storyboarding. Why? Because it allows me, in a very quiet environment, with good coffee and no pressure at all, to dream about the movie alone, you know, to make the movie I want, the ideal movie. I can do the movie I want once on paper, and I deeply love that process. I'm alone with a storyboard artist and I draw every frame and I dream about it. I deeply love that moment.
So certainly he would be aware of the imagery of the wasteland, and I'm virtually certain that the film's environments are influenced by that imagery. The compatibility of Blade Runner 2049 in terms of tone, story, character, and imagery with the wasteland is hard to miss when you're aware of it. It seems to be found not only in Villeneuve's choices of imagery, but also within the writing of the characters and the world building of the film. In another draft of this essay, I got into the granular details of a side-by-side comparison of characters, settings, and themes. In the end, I didn't find it made a compelling case for BR 2049 being a direct allegory of Eliot's epic poem. I don't think that's true. However, if you're interested in diving into the wasteland, let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to get into it with you in a future video. my college thesis was on the aesthetics of modernism, and I used Eliot as a case study for that. Suffice to say that here that the settings, situations, and characters of BR 2049 have interesting parallels with those of The Wasteland. Though they are not necessarily directly connected, they typify the same philosophical questions and ideas. The Wasteland is a similar experience to Blade Runner 2049, grasping in the dark, in the decayed world for meaning. And of course, there are the visual allusions to the poem's imagery, which I've already shown you, some of which may be harder to dismiss as coincidence. The literal stony rubbish of the dead landscape south of Los Angeles, the heap of broken images represented both by Kay's own jumbled memories, some true and some false, dead trees and endless wastes, the nature of a world in which the past has been largely erased by some man-made disaster is generic fodder for techno-dystopian sci-fi, after all, but taken together they amount to more than the sum of their parts. Together they build the kind of world that Eliot imagines in The Wasteland, a world carved from the rubble of a high civilization. The Wasteland is sometimes cited as a foundational work of techno-dystopian or eco-dystopian fiction, and with good reason. More generally, the film borrows heavily from the post-war sensibilities of many modernist poets and writers, and strongly invokes feelings of existential dread and nihilism common in that era. There's obviously also a huge focus on fertility, and the fact that the replicants are infertile, or that the consequence of maybe not being a replicant is that one might actually be fertile, which would change the nature of their existence. It is, at least to me, somewhat hard to imagine that Nabokov's poem, which did not appear in the original novel by Philip K. Dick, could take a central role in this kind of story without the writers also being familiar with Eliot's work. It's really two peas in a pod. The two poems' stark contrasts and mirror images play roles not only as thematic elements, but as markers for plot development. As Kay's investigation of the farm and the body of the replicant Rachel unravels into a sprawling mystery, the waypoints of that mystery are marked by contradictions. A flower in the desert, a serial number on a human bone, bees bursting forth from a sandy waste, the anachronistic retrofuturism of the film's version of Las Vegas, where 50s crooners bust forth into huge empty rooms via holographic projections. This is the classic rubble of modernity, in which metamorphosis from ruin into new life is a core theme. The bees emerging out of nothingness. The idea of a just let's say a note on a piano ringing out in a casino, the casino chips on the tables. Everywhere our protagonist Kay goes throughout the film, the settings are carefully constructed monocultures, where the slightest contrast can become evident. The landscapes themselves contradict each other in imagery, color, and movement. The overcrowded and crazed megacity of Los Angeles and the eerily undestructed wastes of Las Vegas, where time stands still and decay is halted by radiation, with hotel guest baggage still waiting at the check-in desks, and casino chips still sitting on abandoned tables, motionless. The furiously pounding waves of the bleak ocean wall where Kay's final test will take place, contrasted with the silent, endless fields of California's Central Valley, the harsh steampunk futurism of the outside world and Kay's police department contrasting with the 1960s sensibilities of his home life, where he's constructed an elaborate fantasy of normality that no longer persists outside. Indeed, Kay's own existence as a violent and cold-blooded bounty hunter who kills his own kind for humans, like a futuristic Lone Ranger, but who also longs for human connection. The violence of Dave Bautista's Sapper Morton contrasts with his gentle nature and his quiet solitude. Cooking garlic in an old house with a modern airlock. The fact that he was a medic, not a fighter. The bric-a-brac architecture of 2049 LA contrasts with Wallace Industries' highly ordered and monolithic aesthetics. Snow falls in July in California. The memory-making studio is empty and bare, but can be filled with life by the touch of a button. Wallace builds and tries to breed replicants while real human orphans work as slaves in the ruins of starships. Everywhere we look, there are layers of contradiction, the old lumped in with the new. Why is Wallace breeding replicants when there are orphans, thousands apparently, working away in illegal factories outside the city? What is the advantage of breeding a race of people who don't experience, in some cases, human emotions, who can't breed themselves? It's an interesting contradiction to me. As the memory maker suggests in the film, anything real will be a mess. This jumble of monocultures and contradictions serve Villeneuve in highlighting the metamorphosis and contradictions inherent in his characters. The stony-faced Kay, longing for a fictional sitcom home life, notice a televisual life, and the unfeeling and unthinking Joy, convincing Kay of his own humanity and the humanity and love of Deckard, a man who cuts himself off from the world in order to preserve the thing he values most, his own child. Or, as Gaff would suggest, the truth is that Deckard is doing what he always wanted to do. He's being alone. In each case, the landscape mirrors the inward emotional journey of Officer KD 6-3.7, who traverses these landscapes in search of answers to one question after another, each characterized by a set of obstructions and tests he must face. These are the distinctly modern aesthetics of the film. Yet, on another level, the story of Blade Runner 2049 also mirrors the shape of a typical hero's journey, as the story introduces scenes that loop back on each other, demonstrating the growth of Kay's emotional life by showing us his interactions with different environments at different stages of the journey. Returning to Sapper's farm to find the photograph, returning to the orphanage to find a horse, returning to LAPD headquarters for his baseline tests, and returning to his home to experience the evolution of Joy from a tool to suit his own needs into a kind of muse who prompts him to continue his journey of discovery. Returning to Deckard and meeting again with his nemesis Love, and finally returning again to the Memory Maker's studio on his final mission to reunite a father and his daughter. So each time he visits these places, he has evolved from where he was before, and he is more perceptive. These story loops follow a typical hero's journey of challenge, failure, return, success, culminating in Kay's redemption as a person in the moment of his own death. And yet, unlike the typical hero, the film is also at pains to depict Kay as little more than a pawn in a larger story, given only enough information to do what someone else has decided he should. Kay falls in love with Joy, but Joy is the same for everyone. She calls everyone Joe. She tries to convince everyone of their humanity. He thinks that his memory of the horse is real, that it's his and that it defines him, but there are many people who share the same memory, as we find out from the replicant prostitute that Joy invites. She also recognizes the horse, meaning she also has that memory implanted. And it's really just a trail back to Deckard's daughter. In the end, Kay can only gain redemption by finally managing to defy the wishes of other people, keeping Deckard alive and free, even though he knows that this presents the risk of a world-ending conflict. But if we think about Deckard's daughter putting those memories into real androids, into real replicants, it seems to me to be a way for her to communicate to her father, a way for her to get his memories activated in people and allow them to find him. It is only in Kay's ultimate realization that he personally does not matter that he's able to find redemption and humanity in himself. At the end, he's not following a path anyone has set for him. He's doing what he's not supposed to do. To discover that one's own memories are not one's own is both an act of self-discovery and self-annihilation. This abnegation of the rules of heroism is demonstrative of the film's core philosophical ideas, that people are not defined by who they are or what they have experienced, but instead by what they choose to do, what they choose to believe in. It is consequentialist. It argues that everyone has choice, even those who appear not to have choice. In order to be a person, you have to be able to choose. It is only when K makes concrete choices on his own and for his own reasons that he becomes more than a machine. The first time he lies, the first time he doesn't turn someone in, the first time he kills a human being, the first time he refuses an order, all of those things really represent who he is, the choices that he makes. And in that way, it becomes more than a machine, because if a machine can make choices, if a machine can have an executive function and decide its own future based on what it believes, then it is a person. I hope that through this, I've at least convinced you that the film is strongly focused on the aesthetics of modernism, but transplanted into a future world where the lessons of our history have been largely forgotten, and where humanity has fallen into a kind of techno-barbarism. That mirrors the reality of the modernist world in the early 20th century. In this world, rather than human pain and misery being exported to brutal colonies in Africa or India, South America, the world these characters inhabit is the brutal colony of an interplanetary oligarchy, unseen but immensely powerful. The focus on decay in a fallen world, on the rebirth of life within ruins, and on the redemption of the heroes, whether the hero is Deckard or Kay, each of whom have spent a lifetime of denial of their inward selves, a denial of personal freedom and of choice, as a means of adapting to the fallen world which they inhabit, makes this a distinctly modern story. Direct parallels between the accelerating industrialization and ever more brutal forms of colonialism in the early 20th century and the ruthless exploitation of the barren earth of 2049 demonstrate that man and mankind is capable of the same and worse levels of destruction and evil as ever before. In this world, resources are produced largely for the enjoyment of an unseen off-world, which is said to be glorious and grand, but which would more than likely disappoint anyone who reached it themselves. The only information we can glean about the off-world life, is that it is equally violent and exploitative, typified only by brutal violence and more exploitation of replicants in mining colonies, which seek workers to be controlled utterly and experience no emotions, nor deeply interact with the world around them. If that is the reality of the off-world colonies, then the degradation and destruction of humanity and the earth have been ultimately for nothing and for no one. It represents a system where there are no real choices, because the world is focused on sustaining itself at the cost of everything. It's for nothing and for no one. A series of actions with no ultimate goal, other than perhaps the perpetuation of martial power, not unlike the destruction wrought by the senseless Great War, the First World War, the cause of which the modern man of the 1920s could not understand, and which solved nothing that it attempted to. Yet in a departure from the archetypes of the modern, this story clearly takes place in a different kind of wasteland. The wasteland of the modern is the destroyed world of romanticism and grandeur that typified the 19th century. Great buildings destroyed, great monuments wrecked. This is subverted in the world of 2049 by a world of huge megastructures and startling technological power, which nevertheless lives alongside a decayed Earth, suggesting that it is this techno-society which is responsible for the decay. The Los Angeles police headquarters looms above everything else. a monument to power. The monuments of the past are not ruined in the sense of World War I battlefields, but they're instead poisoned by industrialism and terrorism. Meanwhile, the people of this world live with the remnants of a technological age that may have otherwise outstripped their own if it had had the means to survive and provide for its people. Though this world is advanced beyond that of the original Blade Runner in 2019, the brutality and the existential horror of life are only the more terrifying. And I think this amounts to a commentary from Villeneuve telling us 2049 is not the future of our world, but it is a potential future of a world. And that world, such as in 2049, may be one in which people don't make choices. People don't make definitive choices. So much of the conditions between 2019 and 2049 are that nothing has really changed. That power has simply become more centralized. That technology has simply become more powerful, and that alienation of people from each other has only advanced. Throughout the film, we're reminded of the relics of the past from which these monocultures arise. Ancient machines predate the society that uses them, and ancient photographs depict a past that is not present and cannot be an image of the future. These relics exist only as real objects, disconnected from the world they represent. It reminds one of the small coral paperweight that Winston Smith buys in a small shop, which reminds him of the world before the purges of the party. That's the same thing that's going on with Kay looking at the memory crystals of the events of 2019, of the first Blade Runner. The past has been erased, and so these monocultures only hold singular little clues that give us an idea of the past. A figure of a horse, for example, being real is more valuable than a real horse created through biological synthesis. The Badger character would rather trade a real, synthetic horse for a wooden horse. So it's obvious that these relics, these orphaned objects of the past, are highly intriguing to the people because they don't have access to many of them. People who don't know what a tree looks like. These are people who live with really no nostalgia of the past, or I should say no nostalgia, but no kitsch. It's a world where old things, if they're not useful, are thrown away. The past that inhabits these future monocultures is one of spectacle, in which people value images and experiences. As Deckard remarks of Las Vegas, people would come to gamble a little, win some money, lose some money, see a show. And Deckard typifies this hangover from the society of spectacle through an enormous collection of books and art which he has accrued in his exile, reading to satiate his desire for a return to that world of imagery. And in that way, he's very much like Swift, like Robinson Crusoe.
Is that what I smell?
Grow that just for me. Garlic.
Garlic.
Go and try some.
No, thank you.
Building wealth out of solitary work, the Protestant ethic that he believes in. He quotes Treasure Island as well.
Mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now, would you, boy? Many is the night I dream of cheese. Toasted, mostly.
As with the typical hero of the modern story, Deckard lives in denial of the present and relies on the imagery of the past to sustain him in denial of the new reality with which the modern hero struggles. So the modern hero really is someone who is observing destruction from the perspective of acculturation, a former belief in society and civilization which has been crushed. And at first he seeks to fight it and lives in the past, but manages to change when he creates something like a life. Kay's journey mirrors Deckard's, though he has no real memories, so he believes, upon which to draw. Kay also reads.
Treasure Island?
He values a past he does not belong to, a past which shouldn't have any meaning to him. He's a product of a society of post-spectacle, in which experiences have been condensed into a commodity product, used to stabilize an industrial scale of human exploitation, giving slaves authentic emotional responses, and allowing the powerful in this society a convenient avatar to exploit without guilt or thought. This is part of the spectacle, to send androids out to experience unpleasant things and then have them report back to us. This gives us a feeling of power, but also of safety.
Replicants live such hard lives, made to do what we'd rather not. It feels authentic, and if you have authentic memories, you have real human responses. Wouldn't you agree?
Why do the overlords need authentic human responses at all? Why do they need to send humans to begin with? Nothing that Kay really doesn't involves, or ostensibly involves, human intellect. But we find that, in fact, the value of Kay's yearning for some belonging to the past is that he is highly receptive. He can hear in the recordings of Rachel and Deckard that Rachel is attracted to Deckard. He can quickly tune himself into the moods and attitudes of other people, and part of that longing that he experiences is a tool to be able to sense something like that in others. So why employ computers? Well, probably because the experience of ordering around an android is simply something that humans can interface with, something that we can exploit, something that is an experience. If we can't experience something directly, we experience it through the telling, and the telling has to come from ostensibly a human with human understanding and human responses. So it's a society of the post-spectacle. One argument might be that the consummation of a society of spectacle that we talked about is in the creation of our own mirror image, which can experience things for us, which can generate the means to have experiences while saving us from the harshness of our own realities, to do what we would rather not, as the film says, and presumably to feel what we would rather not feel, such as empathy, fear, regret. Then experiences and memories can be manufactured for us. We can live in a world we choose and completely deny the reality of our lives. The ability to dominate another person, not just a machine, and to make that machine the scapegoat and the lightning rod for all that has gone wrong with society must have a powerful appeal. But the human being can retreat completely into a life of fantasy, drug abuse and self-destruction, or if he has the means, can escape into a new world in which that fantasy is made into a real experience, far from the realities of nature and history in the off-world colonies. The American philosopher David Foster Wallace argued that the inevitable result of a society that values spectacle above all else is a divergence from reality, of reality from spectacle. After all, a society that is obsessed with real experiences eventually runs out of real experiences from which to draw for the purposes of fantasy. If people spend most of their time consuming popular entertainment, then the world being depicted in that entertainment must shift away from reality, because there's nothing original within it to depict. If you're writing a show about a modern family, and the modern family spends most of their time looking at phones, what can the show be about? Well, it can't be about people sitting around watching their phones, so it has to be made into a kind of hyper reality, a fictional reality. This is why Kay lives in a 1960s home, because there is no experience in the real world to draw from. It has to be experienced by mimicking the past. His life becomes itself a hyper real spectacle. Think of it this way: what is the book of your life? What is the book of your own life about? If you've spent your life consuming media, as admittedly I have done, then the meaning of your reality is found within that entertainment. Entertainment becomes the reality. And the book of your life is an endless review of films, TV, music, and books you like. That is, again, where we are right now. We're all familiar with people who make these entertainments or other constructed realities their primary meaning in life.
I know it's real. I know what's real.
I have been guilty of it in the past. I think I've gotten better. And I also create, but spectacle is a huge part of my life. We find this in political punditry, where the politics of a thing become its whole reality, or in endless self-referential rap music, where successful art becomes the depiction of success in art. David Foster Wallace put it this way: he said, when you watch tragic events such as the World Trade Center, when people saw that on TV for the first time, many of them believed they were looking at a movie, because they assumed that because nothing like that on that scale had ever occurred in their experience. So the reality, the experience, was filtered through a familiarity with art. And then, to add to this, news commentators talking about the reactions to the World Trade Center become the story. So we are really watching a newscaster listening to the emotional response of what someone else saw. And that is actually what we're consuming when we look at the news. We're consuming someone talking about other people. And that gives us a sense of being with them, experiencing what they experience. It's not about knowledge. The average newscast gives you very little information, but it entertains you by giving you access to the conversation about it, the feelings about it. That's what it's really about. Thus, a real and true depiction of our actual lives would be utterly unfulfilling, because we spend our lives consuming commodity products and enjoying commodity experiences. Watching oneself seek comfort does not produce any form of catharsis. We would not enjoy a Sopranos in which Tony lies on the couch watching 7 hours of TV a day. Yet this is like what he would actually be doing if he were real. He's lazy, he's self-indulgent, and in fact the show plays with this by often showing him lying down on the couch and eating a big bowl of ice cream, suggesting that yes, this is really what his life is about. There is no fulfillment there. There's just more. But you wouldn't want to watch it. So, in a desert of real experiences, films and TV often diffuse this disconnect with reality by embracing the unreality of their situations in a self-aware fashion. This is going to get a little bit metaphysical, but stick with me because it's interesting. The result is a hyper real story reality in which people do not act as human beings, but as avatars for our understanding of the tropes of film, TV, and literature itself.
Yes. No.
Take a recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It typifies hyperrealism, in which characters in the reality of the film are the products of a society of spectacle. Actors and stuntmen and directors.
You are real, right?
I'm as real as a donut, motherfucker.
They are, in a sense, aware of their roles as characters within the universe of the film as well. So they're living a hero's journey while also trying to depict a hero's journey. And the success that Jake Cahill or Rick Dalton. So the exchange between Rick and his stunt double, played by Brad Pitt, saying, "You're Rick fucking Dalton." What he's saying basically is that you are a character, and your character deserves a redemption. So they're aware in the sense that they're in fiction. This helps to explain the love affair. Films like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood typify this hyperrealism. The people are, in a sense, aware of their roles as characters within... Okay, I didn't need to say that whole sentence. Cut. This is an outlet for a mythos which combines real life with the fantasy of Hollywood that it sells to the public. The depiction of making films is a depiction of the reality of filmmakers. And so this becomes one of the few outlets in which filmmakers are able to credibly create a convincing reality that provides a real catharsis. If so much of life is producing films, watching films, then the act of making those films becomes the only real thing to depict. And so Hollywood loves a film about Hollywood, and very often because it represents a reality that they actually recognize. It's one of the few things that provides catharsis, because the making of a film as a cultural event, as spectacle, does have its dramas. Another obvious avenue to avoid this desert of reality is the post-apocalyptic world, which has also become extremely popular. And that's because it represents another hyper-reality in which human beings who are experiencing our current culture, or something like it, are then exposed to a world that has fallen apart, and a new story can begin. Because those entertainments, that spectacle is gone. So Hollywood either embraces in order to subvert, or escapes the society of spectacle by putting its characters in situations where they cannot consume entertainments. And that gives them an opportunity to change. So this is kind of a core setting for postmodern storytelling now, either Hollywood or space or post-apocalypse, simply because it avoids the problems of depicting a real world in which nothing real is happening. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's director, Quentin Tarantino, absolutely one of my favorites, himself has acknowledged his characters are in a society of the spectacle. They are people raised on popular entertainment, and particularly television. They act like movie characters because their reality is the consumption of the types of stories in which they live. Thus, the catharsis in such stories is found in the character's acceptance or rejection of traditional character arcs. This theme can be seen in many of Tarantino's works. In Django Unchained, though it takes place in a society that is pre-spectacle, nevertheless explains the actions of Dr. King Schultz, who helps Django to rescue his wife, as the fulfillment of a German cultural myth of bravery and chivalry. Schultz is compelled to help Django because Django represents a mythos that Schultz needs to actualize in the real world to feel redemption, or to feel that he's done a real thing, is to enact a myth. Even then, his adherence to a mythos leads to Schultz's demise. Ultimately, unsatisfied with the actualization of the myth, the reality of the myth is that he's simply buying Django's wife. He's not concocting a brilliant plan and succeeding as he sort of boasted to Django that he could do. Instead, he's simply buying her, and buying Django's wife. And in doing so, he is admitting that the economics of slavery are what continue to lead its success. That with those $13,000 that he's paying for Brunhilde, Calvin Candy will buy more people. So his disappointment at the realization that the fulfillment of the mythos doesn't slay the dragon, doesn't end the unfairness. Schultz jeopardizes that fantasy in an attempt to destroy the competing mythos of Calvin Candy, the slave owner who views himself as a destined master of an entire race. So when Schultz kills Candy, he is in a sense turning away from his reliance on myth and making a real choice, the only choice that can actually lead to redemption.
I'm sorry. I couldn't resist.
Those who lose in such films, I'm talking about Tarantino's films, are not the bad guys, that's clear, but not always the good guys either. They're those who fail to depart from their own literary archetypes to become more than a stereotype. From Tarantino's canon, Calvin Candy and his slave Stephen, Lieutenant Archie Hickox, Vincent Vega, Hitler, Jackie Brown's Louis Guerra, and the Manson family. They're all representative of this same sensibility in their failure to change, in their adherence to what they see as their archetype. They play out the arc of a classic villain or stooge, and thus are killed, if anything, for the crime of being unoriginal. Meanwhile, Tarantino's winners, the ones who have a redemption arc, are those who depart from those archetypes. Jackie Brown, Jules, Marcellus Wallace, Hans Landa, and even Rick Dalton find redemption by becoming something more complex than they first appeared to be, by transcending the stereotypes. This, to the society of the spectacle, is the point of living, to defy genre, to do the unexpected precisely because they know what the expected is. They'd read the scripts, they've read the scripts, and they've decided to change the ending, right? Rick Dalton and his stunt double, Cliff Booth, they defeat the Manson family. They change the ending. The Inglourious Bastards, they changed the ending of World War II. In Django Unchained, they defeat slavery, right? They do the thing that you're not supposed to be able to do, and that is a redemption arc. And in each of those stories, including things like in Kill Bill, the point is that those who fail are those who fail to change. In this way, Blade Runner 2049's Kay and Deckard both achieve success by defying genre. They cast aside their images as lone gunslingers and become helpless passengers in a story greater than themselves. Deckard, who has consciously receded from the world of the real to live out a life without meaning to anyone aside from himself, makes a human connection. The one thing that he never wanted to do, he does. Kay, who has spent his life seeking human connection, casts this hope aside in favor of helping someone else to achieve it instead. While Deckard wins by becoming helpless and dependent on Kay, Kay wins by doing the opposite and making decisions for himself, and by dying unknown and alone on a staircase in the snow without a personal victory, not being the winner, but in that way he wins. Those who fail to change, like love and joy, are killed. Anyone who is rigid, anyone who is unbending, anyone who does not see their arc and sees their opportunities, make choices, dies. After 10,000 words, I find that concrete conclusions ultimately escaped me. Is Blade Runner 2049 really a throwback to a kind of modernism that has gone out of fashion? Was it commercially a failure precisely because it's too poignantly identified the spiritual desert of the society of the spectacle in which we live? Or was it simply overlong and overboring for most movie-going audiences? I don't know. Do we find redemption in the destruction of our reality, forcing us to change and grow against our will? Certainly, it should be obvious now why post-apocalyptic worlds so fascinate modern viewers. They represent an opportunity for true change, a world in which the limitations and the mythos of the past has been wiped away. Now, we can either reenact those mythos, or we can actually create new choices. When things restart, the optimism for the future of the late 20th century have both come true and failed to live up to their promise. We are here in a technological age, having most of the things that our ancestors, our parents, and our grandparents dreamed of, and yet we find that we are the same, that we face the same problems, that the political situations do not improve. That we were promised that education, that technology would democratize and would connect people, and it hasn't. In large part, it has allowed people to learn, but it has not solved those core problems, because those core problems are not technological. We're faced with the same problems we faced a century ago, when the spiraling growth of technology and human industry did not promote peace and prosperity, but was instead used by the old world to annihilate itself. Is this annihilation ultimately necessary to allow people and societies to truly change? Is the unseen destruction of the world of Blade Runner 2049 the ultimate fate of most people? In short, are war and destruction really the only avenues for human redemption? 2049 subtly argues that this is the case. The impending war between humans and replicants might begin a new chapter for both machines and human beings, in which all are suddenly capable again of change, of choice, capable again of evolution. And yet this realization is painful and frightening. The life and growth are irrevocably tied up with death, and that change is irrevocably presaged by destruction as a terrifying thought. And yet, as Sapper Morton begins at the beginning of this film by saying, "You've never seen a miracle," this implies that the world of 2049 is a world in which nothing distinct, nothing new comes, and that when it does, individuals may realize that they do have more choices than they thought. So the promise of new things comes out of blackness and nothingness. It's a dead tree in the bright desert. It's a tall white fountain, dreadfully distinct against the dark. Thank you for listening.
I understand perfectly, you American shit.
Girl, I like to be liked but alone. She says she likes me very much, and that's fine. Will she love so on to slow down time? I like to be like